right. So I'm doing a screen recording just like last time, and so everything that is now started is now recorded. I will go back to Moodle because everything is in Moodle, and I'm also hoping that everybody knows where to find the class material for this class. Yes?
I don't.
Okay, so you might want to kind of look at the URL on the top. Okay, so you need to go to moodle.losrios.edu. The some profs part is only for the video, but if but this is the URL to go to the content of this class. It's moodle.losrios.edu. I'll write it out here so that you guys can copy it. All right. So there you go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. So once you get to Moodle, you log in, and the way you sign in is with your student ID. I sign in using my own name, so that part is a little bit different from you. And everything that I talk about in class, they're all in Moodle. Oh, I have another message. All right, just ignore that for now. All right. This is today is this is week 2, so we are going to start with topic 2, and that's where we are. Well, we kind of started on that topic: how to evaluate a camera, both video and still. And then we also have the 2 additional links. We'll talk about that later and see whether we have time to cover both of those. So we'll start on the first one. Let me bump up the font size. I'm not going to read entirely from the text here. You should have read it beforehand, or you can read it after too. The first point is size, and I used my camera as an example from last time. It's actually kind of bulky. If you look at it, it's somewhere between a small digital SLR or single lens reflex camera and a little point and shoot camera. I would say it's leaning more to the SLR side. But the image quality is really good. My wife and I went to the FEL Nature Center last Friday, and I was able to capture pictures of deers and turkeys. It's equivalent to a 400 millimeter lens on a 35 millimeter system, which is pretty good. And the image quality is okay. It's not as good as the digital SLR, but it's nonetheless it's pretty good. And I think last time I also talked about the price. This is about $120. I paid $120. It's a refurb unit from wood.com. So they have just crazy deals. Depending on the day. Sometimes they sell pans for frying stuff. Other days they sell cameras, and then some other days they sell HD TVs and so on and so forth. But they do. This is a recurring item, so you might be able to catch it again when they have these items on sale. $120 on sale, and most people agree that it's a good deal, for what you're getting. The only downside is, the size is not really that compact, which means you cannot just put it into your pocket, just like with most of the other point and shoot cameras. So it's a trade-off. We'll talk about the qualities, why I would prefer a camera like this to a smaller camera. So
does it have a thing you can put it on a
yes, in fact I attached a quick release on this camera. So if you guys, I'm not sure whether you can see it, but there's a little attachment at the bottom here. This is a quick release plate for my tripod. So I don't have to screw it on and off to the tripod every single time. I just clip it in place, snap it down, and it's good to go.
Okay.
Yep, it's a quick release mount. Almost every camera has a tripod mount now. Even the point and shoots, they also have a little, I think it's a 20, what is the thread size of a, but it's a typical tripod mount, thread,
okay.
So it will work for all cameras.
Is there a pixel size that you would
for this class?
No, not go below it. I mean, if you were going to buy a digital camera today.
That's a good point. Let us get to that point first,
Okay.
and then we'll talk about the resolution of the sensor. That's what you're talking about, is the resolution of the sensor. Last time we talked about sharpness, and sharpness to us, basically it's what is a sharp picture, what is not a sharp picture. Well, it's pretty easy. To us, sharp means we can make out a lot of details, and fuzzy means we cannot make out a lot of details. But in camera land, when you talk about sharpness, it's actually usually separated into two different attributes. One is called resolution, which means how many lines can be resolved, from as a projected image from the lens itself. And that's a really technical thing. They actually do measurements, based on the captured images and see what is the resolving power of a lens. The other one is called color aberration. Color aberration is basically every lens is kind of like a prism. White light goes through and it gets separated a little bit into the red and the purple. Okay, a good lens design will minimize color aberration to the point that you cannot really see it. A bad lens design or using bad material will have a lot of color aberration, which basically means when you look at a really sharp black and white edge, you will see the color separation. One side will be red and the other side will be blue. We talked about distortion. There are two types of distortion. One type is called barrel distortion. Barrel distortion means straight lines that should be parallel becomes more like a barrel. So that's called barrel distortion. The other one is called pin cushion distortion, which means straight lines that should be parallel becomes more like the shape of a pin cushion. Okay, it depends on how bad it is. Most of the time, if you're not taking pictures of architectures like the pyramid or a cathedral or something like that, the distortion part is not that important. On the other hand, if you want to take architecture pictures, you really need to get a single lens reflex camera with a specialized, they call it tilt, a tilt lens or tilt shift lens for architecture purposes. Does anyone here, have an intention to take architecture pictures? No? Okay. Because that's gonna get expensive. $1,400 just for that lens. The nice thing about lenses with single lens reflex camera is they keep their values. Especially if you buy one used and it's in good condition, you can probably sell it for exactly the same price, 10 years from now, which is actually not too bad. All right, so I think this is basically where we kind of stopped last time. I think we covered a little bit more, but let's go back and revisit maximum aperture. Maximum aperture determines how much light the lens can let through onto the sensor. It doesn't seem to be very important, but it really is very important. It depends on whether you want to take pictures in low light, with only available lights. Like in this classroom, I can actually take a picture in this classroom without turning on the flash, and it will still turn out to be pretty good. And that's because this lens has a large maximum aperture. If you have a camera with a smaller maximum aperture, a lot of times you need to pop up the flash really early. Even though there seems to be plenty of light, you still have to turn on the flash. There are other aspects that is kind of important with the maximum aperture. Some of you might have seen, well, let's go ahead and take a look at some sample pictures on the internet, because I think it's best to take a look at those pictures. Maximum aperture portraiture. Portraits. Okay. So let me take a look at one particular one. Okay, this is a good one. Okay, when you look at this picture, you can see how the foreground, the person, the kid is in is in focus. Everything is really sharp. I guess if you zoom in even better, or if you magnify the picture, you can see that his eyelashes. You can even make out the details of the eyelashes. But look at the background; it's all blurred up. And this is also one of the attributes only possible when you have a large maximum aperture lens. So if you want to take pictures of people, shoulders and up, make sure the face is sharp but the background is kind of blurred. You need a lens with a large maximum aperture. Is that okay so far? Now this has to do with I would call it the squinting effect. Okay, for those of us who need correction, eyesight correction. Sometimes, when we forget to bring our lenses, or just want to be lazy and not to do anything, sometimes we squint, right? Things seem to look a little sharper, and that's called the pinhole camera effect. And that's why, with a smaller aperture, smaller maximum aperture lens, things will be more in focus. Normal is a good thing, but when you want this kind of effect, it's not a good thing.
What's the difference between, I mean, if you're looking for a camera
Mm-hmm.
and you were to ask for large aperture or small aperture, what's the breakdown in what's small and what's large?
That's a very good point. The breakdown is about 2.8. F2.8 is considered fairly large.
Okay.
Anything that's the smaller than F4 or F5.6 is considered small. Most consumer lenses, okay, let me just go to a particular website, or I can bring up the specifications of the lens, the camera that I have. And we'll go to, this is actually another place, another thing that we have to talk about is how do you know which camera is good? How do you read reviews of these things? So I go to different websites, because if you go to one single website, it is possible that the author or whoever runs the website, takes money from the manufacturers, and so the opinion is not always neutral. But if you go to multiple websites, typically you can get something that is, that you can trust. So this is the exact, camera that I have, and when you look at the specifications, let me see, where is the specifications? Usually it's either the first or the last page. No, I don't want Microsoft ads. Okay, performance. Let's try that. Overview, conclusions. All right. It doesn't give me a summary of the specifications, so I need to go find a website with the specifications. But when we go to Kodak's website, they have the specifications too. So we click on specifications here, and then you have to look at the maximum aperture. Try to find where they put it. They don't even list the maximum aperture, which is one of the selling points of this camera. No wonder Kodak has to stay out of that digital camera business. They don't know how to sell the cameras. Yeah.
Is some of the cameras HD or not just video?
Sorry?
Is some of the cameras HD? Or
HD?
Yeah, or is
You
it
mean in
video?
terms of recording the video?
That's just video?
That's just video. HD only applies to the video part. The still picture part is measured in megapixels. We'll talk about that too.
Okay.
Very good. Good point. I'm just trying to find out where I can find the specifications. So let's try this one. See, the lowest price it quotes is $270, but I only paid $120 for mine. It's a refurb unit, but most of the time refurbs are fine. There we go. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's see whether it has the maximum aperture stated here. Nope, it does not. Okay, but it also depends on what is the focal length, because when you have a wide angle, it's actually easier to have a wide maximum aperture. When you have it zoomed all the way out, zoomed all the way in, then it is hard for cameras to have a large maximum aperture.
So if it's
It changes.
It changes. Okay.
Yeah, it changes, and the closer the wider the angle, then the larger the maximum aperture is, and then the longer the focal length. Usually, for most cameras, for most lenses, then you have a smaller maximum aperture.
Okay.
We can go to Amazon and do some lens research, because that's basically attributes of a lens. So we can go for Canon lens, and this is a really wide aperture lens for a very reasonable price, because you can see it's f/1.8, which is a very large aperture. But it's a fixed focal length lens, which means it cannot zoom. Yep.
Are we given it's like, when you look at the numbers that are around the lens, how do we know what goes to what?
That's a good. Okay, so let me see if I can zoom into this particular one. All right, so that's good. We can actually zoom into here. All right, so you can see these numbers here. The 50 millimeter, that refers to the focal length of the lens. So it's 50 millimeters. But whether it's a wide angle lens or not depends on the sensor also. So if you have a smaller sensor, then it becomes a medium telephoto lens. But if you have a large image sensor, this is called what we call a normal lens, which is between a telephoto and a wide angle lens. And then the other number, 1:1.8, which is down here, that's the maximum aperture. The maximum aperture is either expressed as 1 to as a ratio, or expressed as f over something. But whatever this number is, okay, forget about the 1, but the 1.8 number is reciprocal, or this is inversely proportional to the opening of the aperture itself. So the larger the number, the smaller the maximum aperture. The smaller the number, the larger the maximum aperture.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is better than f/2.8. Unfortunately, it's a fixed focal length lens. So
Smaller the number, better the lens.
yep, definitely. So this is what we call the second item here. It's what we call a prosumer zoom lens. Prosumer means it is somewhere between professional and consumer. So that's why it's just usually called prosumer. So it's a little bit better than most, but it's not really exactly good. I would say this one is actually a consumer type. It's not even prosumer. And you can see the aperture is f4 to 5.6. The 4.0 refers to when it is at 55 millimeter. The 5.6 refers to when it is at 250 millimeter. Because sorry?
So it's not very good?
It's okay, I wouldn't say it's great. But to get something that's great, you have to pay a lot more money. So I can show you what those look like. Okay, you can compare the first and this lens here. They're both Canons. They're both 50 millimeter. This is f/1.8. This is f/1.4, and the price is more than what, 4 times? And that's basically reflects how much money people are willing to pay for a larger maximum aperture lens, because it is a very important feature to a lot of photographers. Are we doing okay so far
Yes.
in terms of the concept?
I guess what confuses me is on that one that's the $188.
Mm-hmm.
Something as small as this has a 2.8 or 2.
That's because your sensor is also very small.
Okay.
When your sensor is very
Ratio.
small, it's a ratiometric kind of thing. So
Okay.
when your sensor is really small, f2.8, is not difficult to achieve. But later on, we'll talk about why we want to have a larger, sensor, because it buys you something that a small sensor cannot. But that's a good point to make. Very good point. And we can go to some really expensive lenses here. All of these, including this one. This one is kind of prosumer. If you look at the price, it's $400 something. Let's see, fisheye. This is a prosumer lens. It's a wide range lens. This is a good portraiture lens. If you would like to take portraiture, with the blurred, background effect. 80 millimeter means it's a medium or a telephoto lens, but the maximum aperture is still 1.8, which will give you the blur effect in the background. And it's a very good lens for that type of purposes. And here we go. Okay, 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 lens is $2,000. In digital single lens reflex market, $2,000 is, I wouldn't call it chump change, but it's not considered too expensive either. So that's why I don't use those cameras. I just use my $120 camera. Are we doing okay so far in terms of the concepts? Now, as I said a little bit earlier, the resale values of some of these lenses can maintain over time. In other words, especially for the prime lenses, I paid about $75 for the first lens on the list here from about 10 years ago. I can sell it at $65 easily today. So it doesn't depreciate as quickly as some of the other electronics.
Okay, now I have another question for you.
Go ahead.
Like I have a Canon regular film camera.
Okay.
And I think it has 35 millimeters up to
300.
300.
Right.
Do those can you exchange those lenses with?
If it is a
digital.
Okay, Canon has two mounts. When they had the manual cameras all the way back,
Okay.
it's called I think it's called the F mount.
All right.
And now they have the EF mount, which is electronic. So if you have an EF mount already, yes, it will be interchangeable with
Okay.
all the new lenses.
Okay.
Yep. It depends on how long ago you got it. If you got
It's
the
been
camera
several years.
definitely interchangeable.
Okay.
Yeah, Canon, this EF lens mount, started in the early 90s. So if you bought anything, after the 90s, or mid 90s, it's definitely interchangeable,
Okay.
which is
Thank
a
you.
very nice feature.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So getting back to our notes here. So anyway, if you want to get something out of this class, I would just say that maximum aperture is a very important feature. It has a lot of impact on multiple aspects. One of the other things that most people don't think about is the maximum aperture also determines how quickly your camera can autofocus. Now, why would that be the case? Why do you think that's the case?
Easier to see the image.
Exactly. It's got more light. So when you have more light, there's more contrast. When there's more contrast, then it's easier to figure out whether it's in focus or not. So the maximum aperture attribute of a digital camera also determines how quickly it can focus. If you have a camera that has a smaller maximum aperture, sometimes the AF simply stops working. It just doesn't work. Now the next point is variable focal length, which means whether you can zoom or not. Okay, zoom is a consumer word, but in the design of lenses, it's called variable focal length. Now what that means is, if you want to take a picture, so let's just say that I want to take a picture of this class or a particular thing. Okay, so let's I'm just going to use a prop here. Let's say I want to take a picture of this book. Okay? If I do not have a zoom lens and I want the book to fill up the entire frame, I will have to walk pretty close, probably around here, to take a picture of the book. On the other hand, if I have a variable focal length lens, I can zoom in from here and still be able to take a picture of the book, and it fills up the entire frame. And by the way, the frame simply refers to the image that I'm taking. But it's called a frame from old school technology when we had film, and actually glass film. Glass film is called that's why it's called a frame. Okay. Are there any questions about variable focal length or what I mean by zooming in and zooming out? Go ahead.
So why do they make bigger zoom lens expensive?
Because, well, there are several aspects to it. It's not easy to make a zoom lens and still have good quick picture quality. A zoom lens is more complicated in design. It has a lot of tiny little smaller glass lenses in the inside, and it's really hard to make a zoom lens sharp across the entire focal length range. And that's why it's expensive. And then the second part that makes it expensive is people are willing to pay the money too. So that's why big zoom lenses are expensive. But for the most part, it has to do with the material that they use to. because they have special material to minimize color aberration. So that's why it is expensive, because it's not just normal glass. It's actually special glass, that takes time to make. Now the last point here is called powered zoom. Now powered zoom is kind of an important feature, because if you want to take videos from your camera without powered zoom, that means you have to turn the zoom knob or to change the zoom yourself. It's not smooth. I tried it already. I have a digital SLR that also has a zoom lens, but it's not powered zoom. So when I need to record videos and want to change the zoom or change the focal length, I have to turn it myself, and it's just not smooth at all. So that's one major consideration if you want to get a digital single lens reflex camera and use it to record video. Without a power zoom, it makes the outcome kind of questionable. Are there any questions about what we have talked about so far? Because everything that we have talked about so far relates to the lens of the camera. Now, why do you think the lens is important with a digital camera?
Only the picture.
That's almost one of the single most important part of a camera. Especially if you have one that has interchangeable lenses, I would put the money on the lens, not anything else. Because that's the one part that you can keep. You can toss away the body, and get a new body, but the lenses you can keep.
And without the light entering through the lens, you can't get a brighter picture.
Exactly. And if you have a really good sensor, but the lens is crappy, you still cannot take good pictures. So the lens is the first step, to put all the light into focus, and so you can have a sharp image to capture with all the other devices down the line. Any questions about the lens part? No questions? The next part is the sensor. So after light goes through the lens, it will get focused onto the sensor. So this is the second component that can determine how good your camera is. The first thing is the size of the sensor. So this is also where size does matter. And this is one of the things that most people do not know, because they don't think about it this way. The larger the sensor, physically the sensor is, the more sensitive the sensor becomes. In other words, you can record at lower lights without the grainy and the fuzzy effect. Are we doing okay so far with that concept? Okay. Now some of the cameras come with smaller sensors, which is about 1/3 of an inch across the sensor. The sensor is basically a rectangle. So we are talking about how big is the sensor. And it can go from 1/3 of an inch to, if you look at 35 millimeter, it is more than this size here. So this is a point and shoot, and that's a 35 millimeter sensor. You can see how small this one is compared to the big one. Now they can both have the same number of pixels, but that becomes irrelevant because the big sensor can actually capture light, can capture images at lower lights with lower noises compared to the smaller sensor. The bigger the sensor, the better. But there's one downside to a big sensor. What do you think is the downside of the big sensor?
Size of the camera.
The overall size of the camera. Because the bigger the sensor is, you also need a longer focal length. And with a longer focal length to get the same maximum aperture, the lens itself becomes bigger too. So it's a trade-off. Okay? If you want a smaller camera, you will have to go with a smaller sensor, which makes the lens itself also smaller. But then you'll be sacrificing some of the picture qualities because it becomes more noise. Noise shows up more with a smaller sensor. When I talk about noise and sensitivity, does everybody understand what that is? Well, noise in this case is not referring to audio noise. It's not like the noise that we can hear. it refers to the effect of, okay, let's say you want to take a picture of something that's just gray, okay? It's not, there's no pattern to what you're taking a picture of. With a small sensor, when you look closer, you can always see some pixels being darker, some pixels being brighter, some pixels kind of leaning more to the yellow side, some more leaning to the green side, some leaning more to the blue side. In other words, it's not uniform. The only reason why the pixels are not uniform is because the sensor itself has noises. When you look at the same picture taken with a better sensor, a bigger and better sensor, you will see that the color is more uniform across the pixels. I can show you pictures of that pretty easily. So we can go to any type of review site. You can go to sample images. And they usually take different pictures at different speeds, ASA speeds. But I just want to show you the effect of noise. So here we have, okay, so I'll take a look at this one versus this one. Okay, so I'm going to zoom all the way in. And we'll take a look at this one and zoom all the way in too. I think this is the, which part of a bear? Is that the ear or the hand?
I
Okay.
think it's a reindeer.
It's a reindeer? Okay, can you guys see the differences between these two pictures? Which one is better? This one or the other one?
I would
The
say
other
the
one.
second
The first one. The first one is better. Okay? Why do you think the first one is better? Okay.
More detail.
More detail, and you were right too. But why do you think it makes a difference? You can look at, you can see, how the individual, strands is still visible here, but with the other one, it kind of got all blurred into one blob, okay, for the lack of a better word, okay. And the reason why, but this is taken with the same camera, okay. It's the same camera, same lens, and the same sensor. The only difference is, the what we call the ASA, setting, or the sensitivity setting. This one is taken at ASA, I think 1600 or 800. The other one is taken at, ASA 125. Okay, but it's the same effect between a point and shoot sensor and a 35 millimeter SLR sensor. It's the same type of effect you're looking at. In other words, a picture that can be taken with the same amount of light using a 35 millimeter sensor that can look like that. Using a point and shoot camera, it will look more like this. And they can have 12 megapixels, 14 megapixels, or 16 megapixels. So the number of pixels really doesn't matter unless each pixel counts. Because in this case, obviously they're all kind of blurred into a big mess.
And how do you know what the sensor size is on like a camera you're looking at?
They usually publish the specifications. So in this case, if I look at the specifications of this Kodak, because it is an important factor, so the manufacturer always publishes that. So this one has a 1/2.33 inch sensor. It's still kind of small, and that's why the low light quality is not that good. Now, when you look at a digital single lens reflex camera, I can show you what it looks like. Let's see, we can look at Canon T3i, which is one of their latest, consumer grade cameras. And we'll look at. This is the size of it. So this is, it's called the APS-C size, which is about 22 millimeters by 15 millimeters. It's all right, Jeannie. So you can see how big of a difference it makes, because the other one is basically half an inch across. Okay, this one is quite a bit bigger. It's 4 times the area.
So you're looking at the first number? That 22.3?
You're looking at the diagonal distance between these two. So the actual diagonal distance is going to be about, I'm just guessing, it's about 25, 26 millimeter, which is about an inch. So this one, you can call that, a 1 inch or 1/1 inch, sensor. The other one is 1/2.23. So this one is has 4 times the area, compared to the other. When you go online and look at the sample pictures, you can see digital single lens reflex cameras with sensors of this size. You can push the ASA setting, the sensitivity, to 800, and you can hardly tell there's noise, which means you can go to a restaurant, dimly lit camera, a restaurant, and you can still take pictures without turning on the flash. Any questions about this part? Why do we want to, use a, why don't we want to turn on the flash? What is the big deal of a flash? To preserve night vision, yes. We don't want to turn it on because at nighttime people have the night vision, and a flash can certainly disturb them. But when you're taking pictures, at night, and you use a flash, what do you think is a special effect of a flash that under normal ambient lighting conditions won't happen? Okay, for instance, let's say I have a really crappy camera, and I have to turn on the flash, just to take an indoor picture. Okay, so let's say I'm taking a picture of you, okay, and the flash is set up just right for you. What do you think happens to the background?
Dark.
It's all dark. Okay. What if I take a picture of someone who's further down back? So what happens to you? It's called washing out. Okay, you will be completely washed out. You'll be one white, whole thing. You will be entirely white. I cannot see through it. Okay, so flash can only be optimized for a certain distance. Okay, and then the other thing that's bad about flash is the image is also, if you take a picture of a person, you get harsh, shadow lines, and it just doesn't look very good. And that's why we want to use existing light if possible, ambient light and existing light if it is possible. And that's also why we want to use a larger image sensor compared to a small image sensor, because a large image sensor allows you to take more pictures with existing light compared to a smaller sensor.
Isn't that why you change your f-stops, is to get more light?
Yeah, that helps too. Every bit helps. But your sensor also determines a lot of how low of a light you can take pictures without having to turn on the flash. All right, so moving on with the notes here. So the really small cameras have only 1/3 of an inch, so mine is already one step up from 1/3 inch, but it is still nothing compared to APCS. Actually, it's APS-C, and I transposed the C and the S here. But if you really want a top-notch quality, you need to get a 35 millimeter sensor size. So that's 35 millimeter across and 24 millimeters down vertically. But those cameras are super duper expensive. They run up to $4,000. $4,000 is a starting point with those. And for those of you who want to at least take a look at those cameras, you can look at the Canon 5D. Is basically the entry point to what we call a full frame sensor. Hey, it's not too bad. It's only $1,700.
That's without the lens?
That's without the lens. That's without the lens. That's why I said the $2,000 lens is not too expensive. Can you imagine someone buying a $1,700 camera body only to buy a $100 or $200 lens to match it? People do it all the time. People do it all the time. It doesn't make sense at all.
So what is the 21.1 MP and the 22? So the 22.3 is better than the 21.
Correct.
And MP stands for?
Megapixels. This is basically a Mark II, and this is a Mark III. You can see this is a Mark II and Mark III. So there are two different revisions of the same model. It's kind of like 2004 model versus 2006 model. So the new one is slightly improved in terms of the resolution. But they also make improvements. We'll talk about the image processor and some of the other aspects too. Any questions about these numbers? No questions? Okay. Yep. So that's why I think $1,700 is actually it's a pretty good deal. I know it sounds insane, but it is a good deal. Can you imagine the kind of lens that people pair these things up with? Those would be the lenses that National Geographic photographers, NFL photographers use. And what kind of lens do you think they use? Sorry?
Big zoom.
Big lenses. They're not even zoom. Sometimes it's a fixed focal length. We can look at those lenses too. EF 1000 millimeter. Maybe not. Okay, let's look up 400. They certainly have 400 millimeter. This is a 400-56 f/5.6 lens. It's $1,200. And when you look up, the f/2.8, look at this number. And what is the big deal? What is the big difference between these two? They're both expensive. This one is, yes, I can probably go to a bank and borrow enough money to buy one. The other one is like, I don't know. It's like a car. I mean, you can buy a car with that kind of money. What is the difference? They're both 400 millimeter in terms of focal length.
The maximum aperture.
Yep, exactly. This one has a.
Sorry about that.
All right.
Trying to get the dang thing off.
Okay, so this one has a maximum aperture of f/5.6. The other one has a maximum aperture of f/2.8. But shouldn't that only be like twice as expensive because the number is only off by 2 times, right? No, not quite that way. It doesn't work linearly. Now, in terms of the amount of light, the more expensive lens can let in, can anyone guess how much more light or what is the ratio of light that the larger one can let in? It's actually 4 times, not twice. Because the f/2.8 refers to a ratio according to the radius, not the radius, excuse me, the diameter. Yeah, the radius. But in terms of area, it is the square of the ratio. So the more expensive lens, which is the f/2.8 lens, can let in 4 times the light compared to the $1,000 something lens. Okay. To you and I, it's not worth it. But to a pro, photographer, taking pictures of, in an NFL game, or going to the Amazon trying to take pictures of, animals in a dark jungle or forest, it makes all the differences between whether you get a shot or not. Okay, so to those photographers, it's worth the money because they can actually get the pictures, get the images, and sell them. And they can make money. When they have a larger aperture lens, they can actually make more money to make up for the price of the lens itself. But this is really telling you, how much money people are, willing to put into cameras when it is a tool for, their trade. So, are there any questions? You can probably lease one if you don't want to, really own one. You can go rent one for a day. But the renting cost is actually pretty high too. For a lens like the $11,000 lens, I think the daily rent is going to cost you at least $100. But at least you can hold it. And that's no small. Just holding the lens is no small feat either. The lens is quite expensive. It's 8.5 pounds. It's more than a jug of milk. That's how heavy that lens is. And it's not even close to the heaviest lens of that lineup. Yep. Okay, so next is resolution. Okay, resolution makes no difference whatsoever unless it is a high quality lens, at the front, and also good sensitivity, have a good size. Then we can talk about resolution, because otherwise you just have more fuzzy pixels, which really doesn't help at all. So the resolution in the context of photo sensors, resolution means the number of pixels and that can be recorded. For video purposes, we use these terms here, basically HD high definition terms. 1080p tops out at 1920 pixels horizontally by 1080 pixels vertically, which is actually not very high in terms of still picture. For still pictures, the resolution can go much higher because when we look at this particular camera, it has 18 megapixels already. And that's a lot of pixels. You need a lot of disk space to store the pictures. Are there any questions about the resolution of the sensor? No questions? So I would say about 18 megapixels, somewhere between 12 to 18 megapixels is the norm of today's cameras. But once again, it is important to see what is the quality of the image, because if the lens is crappy, you have more megapixels doesn't really help anything in terms of the picture quality. This is actually a pretty good deal, for $600 bucks or so. The amount of features this type of camera offers is quite a lot. It's not a bad deal. Okay. Noise, that has to do with kind of blurring all the pixels into one.
And those are brand new prices, right?
Those are brand new. These are Amazon brand new prices.
Probably find those refurbished somewhere.
You can probably find those refurbished somewhere, but with cameras like these, I think the reputation of the seller is very important, because sometimes you get what they call gray market stuff. Gray market means it is still manufactured by Canon, it is still brand new, but the warranty doesn't work in the United States. They were intended for overseas markets, so those are called gray market items.
Okay.
And there are different retailers, especially in New York City, there are many different retailers. Some have good reputation, and some have really shady reputation. So you got to be careful when you shop online. Amazon, this is actually sold through Amazon itself. And from personal experience, I know Amazon has a really good return policy. Yep.
I have the same camera, but I bought it from Fry's. It's about the same price.
About the same price? Okay.
Fry's they sell their own warranty for $100 extra, which I got. It's a 3-year replacement warranty. You walk into any Fry's, they'll replace it for you.
Okay, very good. I bought my T2i, not the T3i, from Best Buy, and it was on sale, during those few days, and it was a good deal. This is actually a better price, than the camera that I got. Yep. This is one thing where you can actually pay less money and get more features, down the line. Most of the time, things get more expensive, but with digital cameras, you get less expensive and more features. How thick is your manual? The user's manual? Yeah. Yep.
It's like a real book, like reading a real book.
How much of that have you read?
I watched YouTube videos. I haven't opened that thing. It's still in plastic.
But that's the amazing part. That's really the amazing part, because imagine like 30 years ago, okay? 30 years ago, you get a single lens reflex camera. You have to read the manual, and then you have to buy 5 more books just to learn how do I set the aperture, the shutter speed, all this and that, right? But these days, you get a camera like this, you turn it to the green mode. You know what? Unless you have something that's really tricky, the camera can make better decisions than most photographers. My wife went to China for a trip, so she took some of the pictures where you have the like Shanghai has a lot of lights, city lights at night. So she took some pictures on a boat where there are people in the front and the cityscape in the back. Okay, I know how to take those pictures, but it will take me at least 2 or 3 minutes to set up a shot. Okay, just because I have to balance out the light from the background, the light from the flash, and I have to set the power of the flash to just right, and then do the focusing. How do I focus in the dark? with my own eyes is pretty hard. And the camera that she got, $250, took perfect pictures. Okay, it's just just point, shoot, and everything is good. It has got face recognition, so it knows to what it needs to focus and get the exposure right. It recognizes a night scene, so it knows how to balance the exposure of the front versus the back. It's all with just one press of a button, nothing to adjust. And I told my wife I could not have done a better job.
Well,
Yep.
what kind of camera does she have?
She has a. Now this is by no means any endorsement of Panasonic, but she has a Panasonic camera. Amazon.com. I'm just trying to look it up, so you can see Panasonic. It's a Lumix, and I got it from Costco. It's a ZS19, not the 20. ZS19. Costco had a deal at the time. It was $250, and I would give it a very good rating because she dropped the camera on the Great Wall on the first day. Yep, on the very first day, she dropped it, on basically stone, okay, from about waist height, and other than a big dent that I could see, nothing happened to the camera. She used the same camera for the entire trip and took all sorts of pictures in all kinds of lighting situation, indoor performance and everything else. It all turned out very nice. Yep. And
For
you
a
can
lot
probably
less money.
sorry.
For a lot less money. For a lot less.
For a
money.
lot less.
Yeah. Well, for about this money, her camera was about this price. Mine is even cheaper. I got mine for $120. But you turn these things into the full auto mode, and it can make better decisions than most of us. But still, these specifications are important. Okay, next one is the image processor. Now this is where manufacturers really compete. Okay, and that's because bad grammar there. It should be just compete, not competes. Because between Canon and Nikon and Pentax, and all the other manufacturers, this part determines how quickly you can focus. It depends on how quickly you can take the next frame. Okay, how many frames per second do you need? For me, 1 frame every 5 seconds is more than enough because I take landscape pictures. How often do you think landscape changes? How about the lighting of landscape? Not very quick, right? What if you are taking pictures of your kids running around or pets, running around? You need a lot of frames, right?
Yes.
And that's where the processor comes in. Because the newer cameras have better processors, and they can process, record, and focus much better than the older processors. Okay? And so that's why you need to look at other specifications, which is the number of frames per second.
What's considered a decent one?
Well, let's take a look. I would use, this one is a fairly okay benchmark for a point and shoot. I would say this one can take maybe 2 frames per second or so. But if you look at the Canon, I'm trying to see if it has the specifications here. Okay, just look for the word FPS for frames per second. These are video frames, so they're not really. This one can take close to 4 frames per second. So when you count to 1,000, that's 4 frames. It's good enough for most consumers. It's not good enough if you're taking pictures in an NFL game. Because the thing about the NFL game is, we all look at the magazines, and we look at all the still pictures from different news websites and go, wow, those pictures are fantastic. How can they capture moments like that? The answer is easy. They spray. They take literally thousands of shots and then pick a couple to be published. Okay, and how can they take thousands of shots in a single game? 8 frames per second.
So that's
Or
a
more.
decent size for say if you're taking
For dancing, that's a tricky one because when people are dancing,
Just turning around.
they're turning around, and this will be okay. It depends on how quickly they're dancing, and you'll still be picking out one every 50 frames or so for a really good one. But I would say that's much better than a point and shoot. For the money, for about $600, this is pretty much as good as it gets. You can compare this spec with Nikon, with Pentax, and all the other manufacturers. I would say they are all hovering around 4 frames per second.
And a point and shoot is around 2. And a point and shoot is around 2.
Point two.
A point and shoot is around 2 frames per second.
Point two.
No, a point and shoot.
Oh, point and shoot would be about 2 frames per second. That would be pushing it too. So this is actually, if you want to take pictures of people dancing, especially indoor, you don't want to use the flash because the flash cannot recharge itself quickly enough for that sort of application. So you will be definitely taking pictures without the flash. So without the flash, sensor size matters. The lens matters. You really want to get a f2.8 lens, when you're taking pictures indoor and with all this motion going on, because the maximum aperture of your lens also determines how fast it can autofocus. This is under ideal conditions. So if you have a smaller maximum aperture, like a prosumer lens with f5.6 or f4, your camera may not be able to focus fast enough to take 3.7 frames per second. So there are a lot of factors playing in. But the bottom line is still, the larger the sensor, the better. The larger the maximum aperture is better. If size is not important to you, those things are important. Yep.
Professor, don't they have cameras where the flash can keep up with the frames?
Not indefinitely, because when someone is dancing on the stage, it's pretty far away, right? So your flash actually has to put out a lot of energy, a lot of light, to get enough light bouncing back, to capture on your sensor. So in the case of someone dancing, you really don't want to use the flash because your flash really cannot. If you take one shot, take one frame, yes, you can definitely use the flash. Even so, you'll be stretching it, okay? Because a lot of consumer type flashes, even the ones that can cost up to $300, they cannot shoot out that far. Because you're talking about a little handheld device operating on 4 AA batteries. It doesn't have enough energy to throw out enough light over a long distance. So your best chance is to use a maximum, large maximum aperture lens, and a good photosensitivity, so that you can capture everything without using your own light.
Okay, so basically, if you see something on television, like I was watching this program where this guy was taking pictures, still pictures of Siberian tigers, and he was over there in Russia, but anyhow, it was hard for him to capture the tigers because they're rarely ever seen. But whenever they did come into the sensor range, then his flashes on his cameras was just going off and taking these pictures. So what he basically did was he had that built specially for that, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, you can pair up this camera with like a $300 or $400 flash. It will still have the ability to do it, but you still cannot do it indefinitely. Whereas when you're taking this 3.7 frames per second, means you can actually do it for up to 34 JPEGs. In other words, you can record up to 34. Okay, let me find that spec here. Okay, right here. This means you can take 34 frames at 3.7 frames per second, 3.7 frames per second without having anything to slow you down. And most flashes cannot fire 34 times without having to stop and then recharge itself. So did I answer your question about dancing? Okay. So for your situation, for dancing, and you want to get good frames out of it, I think a single lens reflex camera like this with a good lens will give you much better results than a point and shoot. With a point and shoot, you can take pictures but it will be missing a lot of frames, so you have less frames to choose from, when you want to say, oh, I want this frame or I want this frame. Okay, batteries. Oh, well, I haven't finished this whole thing yet. A good image sensor can make the most out of the lens and image sensors. An average image processor cannot produce good results even if the lens and the sensors are both superior. And image processing is a science. It's really engineering and science. The autofocus speed and accuracy of a camera depends on the image processor. Exposure control depends on the image processor. There are other features too. Face recognition is a big one, scene analysis, and so on and so forth. Face recognition is a big thing because it makes it easy to take pictures and the camera knows where to put the focus on. I can give you a really quick example. So let's say you have a frame here. You have two people kind of spaced out like this, and then you have, let's say, a mountain range in the background. Okay? When the camera takes a picture of something like this, where should the focus be?
On the two people.
On the two people, right? But in the old days, the cameras will always shoot, whatever is at the center. Use the center for autofocus, or put more weight to it. But these days, with face recognition, they can actually see features of a face, and then determine, okay, I think these two are more important than the rest. So the exposure will be based on the faces. When this is a night scene, the background is all dark, with different types of lights, it will make sure the exposure from the flash will first have priority on the face. So face recognition is a really important feature. There are some cameras that can even do a face priority. In other words, let's say you have a family get-together picture, you can actually program your camera and say, don't take a picture unless grandma is smiling. Yes, the camera can tell whether someone is smiling or not. We used to think that's crazy and it's all just marketing hype, but it's not.
So if they do have face recognition, then that means the processor is probably a little bit better than one that doesn't have.
Because it all depends on the programming of the image processor. These are all properties of the image processor itself. But when you look at the specification, you're just looking at facial recognition, okay? Whether it has it or not. In fact, I'm kind of curious to find out whether the SLR, the single lens reflex camera, has face recognition or not, because in the old days, most of these SLRs do not have face recognition. So let me just look for that word, face. Okay. Scene detection. The camera automatically analyzes the image, taking into account faces, colors, brightness, movement, and contrast. In other words, they are giving you, the camera itself can make the decisions based on those particular factors. This is actually new for digital single lens reflex cameras. All right, moving on to some less important features, batteries. Most cameras now use lithium-ion or polymer rechargeable batteries. This is nice because those batteries are light and can recharge quickly. The only downside is, you cannot just buy one when you run out. You really have to carry a few if you want to make sure that you have enough juice. For instance, if you go to a parade, okay, and if you use the flash a lot, your battery will be drained a lot quicker.
Right.
So that's why you need to carry spare batteries if you think that you might run out of battery. A lot of cameras also sell, especially with the single lens reflex cameras, you can also buy an attachment. So even though normally it has to use the specialized batteries, when you put on that attachment, now you can put AA batteries into the handle of the camera, So now you can use just normal batteries. Now we're moving on to the flash. For devices that can record still images, an internal flash can help illuminate when there is little available light or when the subject is backlit. This is an interesting discussion because I can tell from personal experience. In the good old days when we had our kids when they were like 10 years ago, okay, we had a digital single lens reflex camera. The sensitivity is low, so we always have an external flash to provide the illumination. To make the subject to make the shadow not too harsh, we have a bounce light. But because of the bounce light, we are also losing a lot of light, so I have an external battery pack to supply the energy to the flash. So you can kind of imagine how bulky the whole thing is, because there's a bracket, okay? There's a bracket so that the camera can be in any orientation, vertical or horizontal, but the flash is always on top. Because when you take a picture sideways and the flash is on the side, the shadow looks really funny, because it will be casted on the side of the subject instead of on the back of the subject. So you always want the flash to be on top of the camera, but not really on the side of the camera. So there's a flash bracket with a heavy flash on top, a relatively heavy camera in the center, and then there's a big cord coming out from the flash to a battery pack that can only be carried with a shoulder strap because it's too heavy. And that's what we used to do about 10 years ago, because the sensitivity of the sensors was too low, and in order to take any good quality picture, that's the only way to do it. And then guess what? After each shot, the flash will require 4 seconds to recharge itself before the next shot is ready. So my wife got really frustrated because poof, gone. Okay, now the kid is smiling. Oh, cannot take another picture until like 4 seconds later. But these days, we don't use the flash at all. Even inside, indoor, no need to use the flash. And my wife can just keep snapping, cats, kids, whatever. It makes a huge difference. So the importance of the flash is not as much these days compared to the old days. The only time a flash is really helpful is when the subject is backlit. Does everybody understand when I say backlit? I can give you one quick example. All I have to do is to open the door, because outside is really bright, and I'm standing here. You want to take a picture of me. Okay? Most of the time, the camera will make sure the exposure of the background is perfect. Then what happens to me? I become a silhouette. Okay? But if the camera decides to put the exposure control on me, what happens to the background? It gets washed out because it's too bright. So that's a situation where you need a flashlight to fill in the shadow, to fill in me. So what happens is, if you want to take a picture of me standing here, so the camera will actually turn on the flash with just enough light so that I will have about the same exposure value compared to the background. So I will be properly exposed. You can see me, but you can also see the background at the same time. That sort of thing used to take a lot of time, a lot of calculations, and for the most part, it's still kind of trial and error. Okay, I used to be an aperture photographer, so I looked into all kinds of technical stuff like that. It would take me a little bit of time to set up a shot like that, but these days, no, just flip it on, and that's it. And one thing back to the image processor. How much time do you need between the time you turn on the camera and the time that you can take the first shot? It's called a time to first shot. It's an important thing. How much time do you think it takes with a modern even a point and shoot? I would say it takes about a second or two. But with a single lens, with your T3i, how much time do you need?
It just takes pictures right away. So
It's almost instantaneous, right?
As soon as I press the power button, it's ready to go.
Exactly. And that's a very important feature, because in the past, even with the Canon digital single lens reflex cameras, it takes about 2 seconds before you can take the first shot, because the image processor has a lot of stuff to go through, self-calibration and whatnot. But these days, you turn it on, in a fraction of a second, it's ready to take the first shot. So a lot of things to consider. If your camera can take video shots, it might be helpful to have continuous auxiliary light. So, but you can always buy aftermarket stuff for that too. So it's not as big of a deal. Hot shoes, do you want to buy or use an external flash? Now, when do you need to use an external flash? Because most cameras have an internal flash already. The internal flash has a limited range. So if you need to take pictures of something that's further away and the internal flash cannot throw out enough light for that purpose, you will need an external flash. And to connect to an external flash, you need something that, it's called a hot shoe. Basically it's a bracket on the top of a camera where you can insert a external flash to it. Now these days, most digital single lens reflex cameras can coordinate multiple external light sources wirelessly. Let me just pass the roll sheet because we have a few minutes left. Now this is a big deal. When was the last time you go to a wedding where there's a professional photographer? To me, that was many years ago. Yep, go ahead.
About 96.
About 96? How many lights did the photographer use?
Oh, they had a whole setup. They had reflection gear to make it reflect off the front.
But it was not wireless before, so you have wires running everywhere, and then you have to worry about the guests tripping over the wires and stuff like that. These days, they're all wireless. So there's no wiring between the flashes, and you can even control the power of the flashes of the different units remotely. You can say flash A, half power, flash B, a quarter power, and then flash C, full power. And your camera is not even connected using any wires to any of the flashes. The $600 single lens reflex camera has that feature already. So this is how things have has progressed over time. Waterproofing, whether it's important or not depends on what kind of picture you take. In your case, dancing does not require waterproofing. But if you want to take a camera to a rafting trip, or to take pictures of kids swimming, then waterproofing is important. And it's not expensive anymore. There are point and shoot cameras about $150, $200 that already has waterproof capabilities.
They have the disposable ones as well for like $20. Just if you need it.
Are they digital or film? Digital. Wow.
Just disposable.
Disposable. Some cameras can be worn. Okay, these are called either extreme sport cameras or, they're different names, but they're intended to be mounted on a bike helmet or a handlebar or something like that. So people can take pictures of their adventures when they rode their bike downhill at 30 miles per hour over rough terrain. And then the last point is actually also very important. How much do you want to spend on your camera? That's a big question. It depends on whether it's a tool, you're going to use it for, to make money, or it is really just an expensive hobby. So it depends. And from personal experience, I can tell you that, it's not worth it to buy the very cheap ones, because, you end up wanting to buy another one and then another one and then another one. So usually it's good to buy buy something that fits all your requirements, or most of your requirements. Any questions at this point? No questions? Okay, we have a few seconds left, so I'll just go ahead and cover everything here. The first thing you have to do if you are in the market to buy a new camera is you have to decide what is important to you. And the first thing you have to think is, how am I going to use this camera? Am I going to use it in a graduation ceremony? Has anyone tried to shoot pictures in the graduation ceremony? Okay. What was your experience?
It's a long time ago.
Okay. But my personal experience
far away.
is you're too far away, exactly. And they won't let you walk up front, because they have their own professional photographers. So a longer lens, can be helpful. But you don't want to buy a $11,000 lens, but you can rent one. You can rent one for the less expensive one for maybe $50, $75 a day. It's still worth it, if you're taking pictures like that. And in your case, for dancing, you can also rent a lens first, try it out, and see whether it is what you want before you actually buy one. All right, we are running out of time today. I will give you a homework assignment for this week, which is based on this sort of thing. I just want you to kind of pretend that you are in the market to buy a new camera, and then you have to tell me which one you're deciding on and why you choose that one. Not every single attribute is important. You have to pick out the ones that are important for you. I'll see you guys on Wednesday.
Are you going to put that on Moodle? Are you going to put that assignment on Moodle?
Yes, all homework assignments will be on Moodle.